The Great Utopia. There can be no doubt that most of those in the democracies who demand a central direction of all economic activity still believe that socialism and individual freedom can be combined. Yet, socialism was early recognized by many thinkers as the gravest threat to freedom. It is rarely remembered now that socialism in its beginnings was frankly authoritarian. It began quite openly as a reaction against liberalism of the French Revolution. The French writers who laid its foundation had no doubt that their ideas could be put into practice only by a strong dictatorial government. The first modern planners, Saint-Simon, predicted that those who did not obey his proposed planning boards would be treated as cattle. Nobody saw more clearly than the great political thinker de Tocqueville that democracy stands in an irreconcilable conflict with socialism. Democracy extends the fear of individual freedom, he said. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man, he said in 1848. While socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number, democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word: equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. To allay these suspicions and to harness to its cart the strongest of all political motives, the craving for freedom, without which political freedom was not worth having. To make this argument sound plausible, the word freedom was subjected to a subtle change in meaning. The word had formerly meant freedom from coercion, from the arbitrary power of other men. Now it was made to mean freedom from necessity, release from the compulsion of the circumstances which inevitably limit the range of choice of all of us. Freedom in this sense is, of course, merely another name for power or wealth. The demand for the new freedom was thus only another name for the old demand for a redistribution of wealth. The claim that a planned economy would produce a substantially larger output than the competitive system is being progressively abandoned by most students of the problem. Yet it is this false hope, as much as anything, which drives us along the road to planning. Although our modern socialist promise of greater freedom is genuine and sincere, in recent years, observer after observer has been impressed by the unforeseen consequences of socialism, the extraordinary similarity in many respects of the conditions under communism and fascism. As the writer Peter Drucker expressed in 1939, the complete collapse of the belief in the attainability of freedom and equality through Marxism has forced Russia to travel the same road toward a totalitarian society of unfreedom and inequality, which Germany has been following. Not that communism and fascism are essentially the same. Fascism is the stage reached after communism has been proved an illusion, and it has proved as much an illusion in Russia as in pre-Hitler Germany. No less significant is the intellectual outlook of the rank and file in the communist and fascist movements in Germany before 1933. The relative ease with which a young communist could be converted into a Nazi, or vice versa, was well known. Best of all, to the propagandists of the two parties, the communists and Nazis clashed more frequently with each other than other parties, simply because they competed for the same type of mind and reserved for each other the hatred of the heretic. Their practice showed how closely they are related to both the real enemy. The man with whom they had nothing in common was the liberal of the old type, while to the Nazi the communist, and the communist the Nazi, and to both the socialist are potential recruits made of the right timber. They both know that there can be no compromise between them and those who really believe in individual freedom. What is promised to us as the road to freedom is in fact the high road to servitude. For it is not difficult to see what must be the consequences when democracy embarks upon a course of planning. The goal of the planning will be described by some such vague term as the general welfare, there will be no real agreement as to the ends to be attained, and the effect of the people's agreeing that there must be central planning without agreeing on the ends will be rather as if a group of people were to commit themselves to take a journey together without agreeing where they want to go, with the result that they may all have to make a journey which most of them do not want at all. Democratic assemblies cannot function as planning agencies. They cannot produce agreement on everything, the whole direction of the resources of the nation, for the number of possible courses of action will be legion. Even if a Congress could, by proceeding step by step and compromising at each point, agree on some scheme, it would certainly in the end satisfy nobody. To draw up an economic plan in this fashion is even less possible than, for instance, successfully to plan a military campaign by democratic procedure. As in strategy, it would become inevitable to delegate the task to experts, and even if, by this expedient, a democracy should succeed in planning every sector of economic activity, it would still have to face the problem of integrating these separate plans into a unitary whole. There will be a stronger and stronger demand that by some board or some single individual should be given powers to act on their own responsibility. The cry for an economic dictator is a characteristic stage in the movement toward planning. Thus, the legislative body will be reduced to choosing the persons who have practically absolute power. The whole system will tend toward that kind of dictatorship, in which the head of the government, from time to time confirmed in his position by popular vote, but where he has all the power at his command to make certain that the vote will go in the direction that he desires. Planning leads to dictatorship because dictatorship is the most effective instrument of coercion and, as such, essential if central planning on a large scale is to be possible. There is no justification for the widespread belief that, so long as power is conferred by democratic procedure, it cannot be arbitrary. It is not the source of power which prevents it from being arbitrary. To be free from dictatorial qualities, the power must also be limited. A true dictatorship of the proletariat, even if democratic in form, if it undertook centrally to direct the economic system, would probably destroy personal freedom as completely as any autocracy has ever done. Individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose, to which the whole of society is permanently subordinated. To a limited extent, we ourselves experience this fact in wartime, when subordination of almost everything to the immediate and pressing need is the price at which we preserve our freedom in the long run. The fashionable phrase about doing the purposes of peace what we have learned to do for the purposes of war are completely misleading, for it is sensible to temporarily sacrifice freedom in order to make it more secure in the future. But it is quite a different thing to sacrifice liberty permanently in the interests of a planned economy. To those who have watched the transition from socialism to fascism at close quarters, the connection between the two systems is obvious. The realization of the socialist program means the destruction of freedom. Democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is simply not achievable. Why the worst get on top? No doubt, an American or English fascist system would greatly differ from the Italian or German models. No doubt, if the transition were effected without violence, we might expect to get a better type of leader. Yet this does not mean that our fascist system would in the end prove very different or much less intolerable than its prototypes. There are strong reasons for believing that the worst features of the totalitarian systems are phenomena which totalitarianism is certain sooner or later to produce. Just as the democratic statesman who sets out to plan economic life will soon be confronted with the alternative of either assuming dictatorial powers or abandoning his plans, so the totalitarian leader would soon have to choose between disregard of ordinary morals and failure. It is for this reason that the unscrupulous are likely to be more successful in a society tending toward totalitarianism. Who does not see this has not yet grasped the full width of the gulf which separates totalitarianism from the essentially individualist Western civilization. The totalitarian leader must collect around him a group which is prepared voluntarily to submit to that discipline they are to impose by force upon the rest of the people. That socialism can be put into practice only by methods of which most socialists disapprove is, of course, a lesson learned by many social reformers in the past. The old socialist parties were inhibited by their democratic ideals. They did not possess the ruthlessness required for the performance of their chosen task. It is characteristic that both in Germany and in Italy, the success of fascism was preceded by the refusal of the socialist parties to take over the responsibilities of government. They were unwilling wholeheartedly to employ the methods to which they had pointed the way. They still hoped for the miracle of the majorities agreeing on a particular plan for the organization of the whole of society. Others had already learned the lesson that in a planned society, the question can no longer be on what do a majority of the people agree, but what the largest single group is whose numbers agree sufficiently to make unified direction of all affairs possible. There are three main reasons why such numerous group with fairly similar views is not likely to be formed by the best, but rather by the worst elements of any society. First, the higher the education and intelligence of individuals become, the more their tastes and views are differentiated. If we wish to find a high degree of uniformity in outlook, we have to descend to the regions of lower moral and intellectual standards, where the more primitive instincts prevail. This does not mean that the majority of people have low moral standards. It merely means that the largest group of people whose values are very similar are the people with low standards. Second, since this group is not large enough to give sufficient weight to the leader's endeavors, he will have to increase their numbers by converting more to the same simple creed. He must gain the support of the docile and the gullible, who have no strong convictions of their own but are ready to accept ready-made systems of values, if it is only drummed into their ears sufficiently, loudly, and frequently. It will be those whose vague and imperfectly formed ideas are easily swayed and whose passions and emotions are readily aroused who will thus swell the ranks of the totalitarian party. Third, to weld together a closely coherent body of supporters, the leader must appeal to a common human weakness. It seems to be easier for people to agree on a negative program, on the hatred of an enemy, on the envy of the better off, than on any positive task. The contrast between the we and the they is consequently always employed by those who seek the allegiance of huge masses. The enemy may be internal, like the Jew in Germany or the kulak in Russia, or he may be external. In any case, this technique has the great advantage of leaving the leader greater freedom of action than would almost any positive program. Advancement within a totalitarian group or party depends largely on the willingness to do immoral things, the principle that the end justifies the means, which in individualistic ethics is regarded as the denial of all morals. In collectivist ethics becomes necessarily the supreme rule. There is literally nothing which the consistent collectivist must not be prepared to do if it serves the good of the whole, because that is to him the only criterion of what ought to be done. Once you admit that the individual is merely a means to serve the ends of the higher entity called society or the nation, most of those features of totalitarianism which horrify us follow of necessity. From the collectivist standpoint, intolerance and brutal suppression of dissent, deception, and spying, the complete disregard of the life and happiness of the individual are essential and unavoidable. Acts which revolt all our feelings, such as the shooting of hostages or the killing of the old or sick, are treated as mere matters of expediency. The compulsory uprooting and transportation of hundreds of thousands becomes an instrument of policy approved by almost everybody except the victims. To be a useful assistant in the running of a totalitarian state, Therefore, a man must be prepared to break every moral rule he has ever known if this seems necessary to achieve the end set for him. In the totalitarian machine, there will be special opportunities for the ruthless and unscrupulous. Neither the Gestapo nor the administration of a concentration camp, neither the Ministry of Propaganda nor the SA or SS or their Russian counterparts are suitable places for the exercise of humanitarian feelings. Yet, it is through such positions that the road to the highest positions in the totalitarian state leads. A distinguished American economist, Professor Frank H. Knight, correctly notes that the authorities of a collectivist state would have to do these things whether they wanted to or not. And the probability of the people in power being individuals who would dislike the possession and exercise of power is on a level with the probability that an extremely tender-hearted person would get the job of whipping master in a slave plantation. A further point should be made here. Collectivism means the end of truth. To make a totalitarian system function efficiently, it is not enough that everybody should be forced to work for the ends selected by those in control. It is essential that the people should come to regard these ends as their own. This is brought about by propaganda and by complete control of all sources of information. The most effective way of making people accept the validity of the values they are to serve is to persuade them that they are really the same as those they have always held, but which were not properly understood or recognized before. And the most efficient technique to this end is to use the old words but change their meaning. Few traits of totalitarian regimes are at the same time so confusing to the superficial observer and yet so characteristic of the whole intellectual climate as this complete perversion of language. The worst sufferer in this respect is the word liberty. It is a word used as freely in totalitarian states as elsewhere. Indeed, it could almost be said that wherever liberty as we know it has been destroyed, this has been done in the name of some new freedom promised to the people. Even among us, we have planners who promise us in a collective freedom, which is as misleading as anything said by totalitarian politicians. Collective freedom is not the freedom of the members of society, but the unlimited freedom of the planner to do with society that which he pleases. This is a confusion of freedom, with power carried to the extreme. It is not difficult to deprive the great majority of independent thought, but the minority who will retain an inclination to criticize must also be silenced. Public criticism or even expressions of doubt must be suppressed because they tend to weaken support of the regime. As Sidney and Beatrice Webb report of the position in every Russian enterprise, whilst the work is in progress, any public expression of doubt that the plan will be successful is an act of disloyalty and even of treachery because of its possible effect of the will and efforts of the rest of the staff. Control extends even to subjects which seem to have no political significance. The theory of relativity, for instance, has been opposed as Semitic attack on the foundation of Christian and Nordic physics, and because it is in conflict with the dialectical materialism and Marxist dogma. Every activity must derive its justification from conscious social purpose. There must be no spontaneous, unguided activity, because it might produce results which cannot be foreseen and for which the plan does not provide. The principle extends even to games and amusements. I leave it to the reader to guess where it was that chess players were officially exhorted that we must finish once and for all with the neutrality of chess. We must condemn once and for all the formula chess for the sake of chess. Perhaps the most alarming fact is that contempt for the intellectual liberty is not a thing which arises only once a totalitarian system is established, but can be found everywhere among those who have embraced a collectivist faith. The worst oppression is condoned if it is committed in the name of socialism. Intolerance of opposing ideas is openly extolled. The tragedy of collectivist thought is that while it starts out to make reason supreme, it ends by destroying reason. There is one aspect of the change in moral values brought about by the advance of collectivism, which provides special food for thought, is that the virtues which are held less and less in esteem in Britain and America are precisely those on which Anglo-Saxons justly prided themselves, in which they were generally recognized to excel. These virtues were independence, self-reliance, individual initiative, and local responsibility. The successful reliance on the voluntary activity, non-interference with one's neighbor, and tolerance of the different, and a healthy suspicion of power and authority. Almost all the traditions and institutions which have molded the national character and the whole moral climate of England and America are those which the progress of collectivism and its centralistic tendencies are progressively destroying. Planning versus the rule of law. Nothing distinguishes more clearly a free country from a country under arbitrary government than the observance in the former of the great principles known as the rule of law. Stripped of technicalities, this means that government, in all its actions, is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand, rules that make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances, and to plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. Thus, within the known rules of the game, the individual is free to pursue his personal ends, certain that the powers of government will not be used deliberately to frustrate his efforts. Socialist economic planning necessarily involves the very opposite of this. The planning authority cannot tie itself down in advance to general rules which prevent arbitrariness. When the government has to decide how many pigs are to be raised, or how many buses are to run, which coal mines are to operate, and at what prices shoes are to be sold, these decisions cannot be settled for long periods in advance. They depend inevitably on the circumstances of the moment, and in making such decisions, it will always be necessary to balance one against the other, the interests of various persons and groups. In the end, somebody's views will have to decide whose interests are more important, and these views must become part of the law of the land. Hence, familiar fact that the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. The difference between the two kinds of rule is important. It is the same as that between providing signposts and commanding people which road to take. Moreover, under central planning, the government cannot be impartial. The state ceases to be a piece of utilitarian machinery intended to help individuals in the fullest development of their individual personality, and becomes an institution which deliberately discriminates between particular needs of different people and allows one man to do what another must be prevented from doing. It must lay down a legal rule how well off a particular people shall be and what different people are allowed to have. The rule of law, the absence of legal privileges of particular people, are designated by authority, is what safeguards that equality before the law, which is the opposite of arbitrary government. It is significant that socialists and Nazis have always protested against merely formal justice, that they have objected to law which had no views on how well off particular people ought to be, that they have demanded a socialization of the law and attacked the independence of judges. In a planned society, the law must legalize what, to all intents and purposes, remains arbitrary action. If the law says that such a board or authority may do what it pleases, anything that board or authority does is legal, but its actions are certainly not subject to the rule of law. By giving government unlimited powers, the most arbitrary rule can be made legal, and in this way, a democracy may set up the most complete despotism imaginable. The rule of law was consciously evolved only during the liberal age, and as one of the greatest achievements, it is the legal embodiment of freedom. As Immanuel Kant put it, man is free if he needs obey no person, but solely the laws.